Okay, so we're ready to go. So what we're talking about is this is actually the third week in a series. We've been talking about homelessness in the Bible. Okay, so first week we talked about how God is homeless, and last time we talked about immigrants, who the Bible calls strangers. Right. You guys remember that? Yeah. Talking about strangers and talking about people coming into Israel and how all that thing worked.
Yep.
Okay, today we're going to talk about a little bit more traditional homeless type stuff. So let me ask you, you guys have been homeless before? Long time. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a weird question that most people don't ask. What good things do you think you might have learned from being homeless? What are some positive things that may have been good from being homeless?
To not take things for granted.
To not take things for granted? That anything could happen, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I basically learned, because before I was homeless, I hate to say this, but I used to say, look at the people on the street and say, what is that young person out there standing with the sign for? They should be working. You know, and it opened your eyes, because a lot of them, they have records. Nobody wants to hire them if they have, been in prison or something. And I think a lot of them, well, I know a lot of them were in prison and stuff, and they can't rent a place. They won't let them have a job because they don't trust them. And this is what people have told me out there. And you just realize that, yeah, you can't take anything for granted, because it can happen to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the biggest things I learned is your health goes downhill fast. Whether you're in perfect condition when you get out there, because I went downhill, lost a lot of weight.
Yeah.
Worry. And I worried that when I was in a home, I worried worse when I was out. But I learned getting back into a place that I don't worry so much, because look what I've been through already.
Mm. So you're kind of a little bit more, you're appreciating what you have.
Exactly.
And at the same time, you learn to empathize with the people who are still out there. Okay.
Yep.
That's great.
And if I had a lot of money, I'd be out there helping them all. And you don't hear that from many people unless they've been in that situation. There's a few, but yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Linda?
I was homeless a little bit, but not for much. But I didn't lose anything, and I had my boyfriend Jimmy with me at the time, who helped me out a lot.
Yeah.
And that's where I lost all my weight, when I was homeless.
Yeah.
And then we moved. Then a lady took us into her house for a couple of months until I got the apartment where I'm living at, where I live now.
That's nice.
Yeah. Is there anything that maybe you see differently after you've been homeless than you saw before?
Well, I eat differently. I don't like to eat anytime after 7 o'clock at night.
Oh, interesting.
I always eat before 7 o'clock at night.
Oh, okay.
If I'm going to eat dinner, I eat dinner between like 4 and 6.
Oh,
wow.
And then if I want anything else, I love ice cream. So I'll eat that later on in the evening,
right?
With my chocolate ripped all over the top.
Yeah, mine was always cold cereal. I always liked a bowl of cold cereal before I went to bed. Captain Crunch, Lucky Charms, or Cocoa Puffs.
Yeah, see.
All the bad ones.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is that I used to eat ice cream at night, but then it's just like I can't do that anymore. So now I just have like a small bowl of cereal, and I do that to exchange it, to take its place.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, all right. Then what I want to talk about is how the funny thing is how God put so many people in the Bible through homelessness. Sometimes for a long time, sometimes for a short time. We're going to kind of cover a number of people, not all the people, but a number of the people who went through homelessness in the Bible, and talk about a few of the lessons that they learned by that. So I just want to explain a little bit about what homelessness looks like in the Bible. I'm just going to very quickly kind of go over that. So first of all, we talked about being an immigrant or a stranger, where you have to leave your country and go to another country. Go to another country, you're automatically homeless for a while. In the ancient world, it isn't that way now necessarily, but it was in the ancient world. That's how it happened. Another thing that would happen along those lines is you could get kicked out of your country because we don't want you here anymore. You get kicked out, and you got to go somewhere else. And that used to happen a lot. Anyway, but now it doesn't happen quite so much. Now they put you in jail.
Right.
They don't like it, they put you in jail.
Yep.
Okay. The most common thing that we see about people being homeless are people who are living in what they call in the Bible the wilderness. Basically, living in the wilderness just means you're living far away from a city. You're living in untamed land, in land that hasn't been irrigated, land that isn't ready for any farms, land that a lot of times in the Bible, it's land that's really dry. A lot of times it's desert land.
We got it pretty easy nowadays compared to back then.
Well, probably so, yeah. It was hard because back then, where were you going to get your food?
Right.
In the city, when you're homeless in the city nowadays, then, even if there's no place to go and eat, there's always a dumpster.
Yep.
And so you can do that. Another thing that's generally an indication of being homeless in the Bible is living in a tent. There's two kinds of tent living in the Bible. One is basically you're homeless, you don't have anywhere to stay, so that means you're living in a tent. That means you can pick up and move anytime. But the other type of person is a person who kind of isn't exactly homeless, and those are nomads, people who permanently live in tents, and they will pick up and move because they want to. But the tents that they live in a lot of times are very nice tents. Really big, roomy, very nice tents. And those people would say living in one of their tents is as good as living in any city, and all that. And so that's the sort of thing where to each their own. There's lots of different peoples who are even nomadic today, still nomadic. People who live that way, not so much anymore. But like the Arabic people, some of those Arabic people used to be nomadic, and would live in tents. Not all of them, but some of them. And then the other thing is people who are just wandering. They're wandering from place to place, and they may not. This would more be look a little bit more like couch surfing. Staying at different people's places. So they may stay here for a while and then here and then here. When Jesus was doing his ministry, that's the kind of homeless he was. It wasn't that he didn't have a roof, it's just that he didn't know from day to day where he was going to stay. He would go into a city and then he'd have to figure it out. His apostles ended up doing the same thing. They'd go into a city, they'd have to figure out if they could stay anywhere or anything like that. So they'd wander from place to place and do that. So those are the different kinds of homelessness that we see in the Bible, different styles. Now you think about it, it isn't that different from now. We have people who live in tents now.
That don't want to live in an apartment or anything.
Exactly. There are some people who prefer to live a nomadic lifestyle. There are people who live in tents who have to live in a tent, not because they want to. There's people who couch surf. almost all of them don't want to couch surf, but there's a few that do. And then there's people who have gone from one country to another, and then they don't have anywhere to go. And sometimes those people live in refugee camps, which is kind of a group homelessness kind of thing. So, it's not that different. We still have a lot of these same solutions. We also have other folks who just have like a sleeping bag and they sleep on the sidewalk.
Right.
See
a lot of that downtown.
See a lot of that, and so people who don't even have tents, and they're just trying to make it, and then of course we've got other kinds of people who live in cars. They didn't have that in the ancient world. Didn't have people living in cars in the ancient world, or in RVs or anything like that. So that's a very different kind of living than what they used to have. Anyway, all right. So let's talk about different kinds of people who were homeless. First thing I want to point out is that at one point, God wanted every single person who was alive to be homeless. This is a strange thing. Okay, so Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. Did you want to write down the verses so you can look them out later? I've got a pen right here.
I do have paper.
Okay.
I brought everything but my glasses.
Okay. So this is Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. So Noah went and he got on the ark and he did the whole flood. And then after the flood was over, God talked to Noah and said, I've got some commands to give you. He has a whole list of commands, and these commands are in Genesis chapter 9. Okay? Now remember, the only people on earth at the time is Noah and his sons and their wives. Oh, Noah's wife. Okay, those are the only people that are alive. And so the first thing that God tells them when they get off the ark is God bless Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Okay, that makes sense. That's really simple. It's almost the same as what God told the first people, Adam and Eve, who were created in the very first chapter of Genesis. He said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. But it's very specific, fill the earth. If you're going to fill the earth, you're going to have to go out there, right? You can't stay in one place. You got to get out there, right? Okay. Only about a chapter later, in Genesis chapter 11, you got this going on. Now, the whole earth, meaning every person who was alive, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone and used tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. We know what this story is, right?
Yep.
Tower of Babel, right? Yep. Tower of Babel, whatever you want to call it. Okay. Now, most of us learned that the problem with the Tower of Babel is that they thought that they could reach up to God and be equal with God. That is not the problem. You know what the problem was? They thought that they could build a town where everyone would live in the same place.
Oh.
They're doing the opposite of what God told them to. God told them to fill the earth, and they're saying, hey, let's all live in one place. Okay, so what's the end of the Tower of Babel? What does God do to these people? You remember?
No.
He made it so that way they couldn't understand each other.
Oh, yeah.
Remember? So that way they couldn't speak each other's language anymore.
Yep.
And so then they had arguments, and then they split up and filled the earth because they left each other. They went away from each other. But that's because God didn't want them all in one place. He wanted them to fill the earth. So he's like, would you please go out there and establish homes and build farms and go out into the wilderness and do the hard work of tilling the ground and making sure that everything's okay. So he wanted at that point, that's not necessarily now, but at that point, God wanted everybody to be homeless because he wanted them to go out and get the whole earth filled. I can say that at this point, we have fulfilled that command. Humanity is everywhere, even in Antarctica, where it's really cold and nobody should really be there. But there's people down there. And so I would say that right now we have done that command, that God is not necessarily interested in every human being or in all of humanity being homeless anymore. He's not interested in that. However, he certainly chose certain. When he chooses certain people, he almost always chooses for them to be homeless. This begins with a guy named Abraham, although his name was actually Abram to begin with. Okay, so Genesis chapter 12, start at verses 1 through 3. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Okay, so now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So God has this great, amazing blessing for Abram. This is, by the way, this is the first thing we ever hear about Abram. We know a little bit about him, that we know that he left his father's house, but we don't really know that much about him. And so what God is telling Abram is he's saying, I have got these big blessings for you. You're going to be one of the most important people who ever lived, which is true. You're going to be one of the most important people who ever lived. But to start out, I want you to just go, and I'll tell you when to stop. And so Abraham just wandered. He wandered for a while until he reached the land of Canaan. And then God said, "Stop. I want you to stay here," except that he has no land there. So Abram lived homeless in the land that God had promised him for the rest of his life, and he never had a home. He always lived in a tent, like a nomad. Yeah, he just went from place to place to place to place. And when they didn't like him in one place, then he had to go and live in another. And then he had children. And you know what happened to those children? They learned to be homeless. And they were just homeless. And they were just homeless all the time. They all lived in tents. And sometimes they lived together and sometimes they lived separately. But they were just all over. So, and then when he had a grandchild, his grandson Jacob and Esau, they were homeless. And that continued on until finally Jacob, in his old age, when he had all these sons and they all were homeless, they all moved down to Egypt. And then in Egypt, they were allowed to have a piece of land. And that was the first time in 4 generations.
Wow.
Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's kids. Yeah, 4 generations that they were not homeless. And so God had them be homeless all that time. And that was part of God's plan. Part of God's plan was that he wanted them to be homeless. Okay, so, and then, but the fact is that once they had a home in Egypt, then they were there in Egypt for 400 years. And for the last 100 years, they were slaves.
Wow.
So, I'm not always great being housed either, Okay. Then number 3, Moses. Now Moses, he, I just feel horrible for Moses. So Moses lived in Egypt as part of the royal family in Egypt for 40 years. Then he found out that he was part of the children of Israel who were slaves. And so he started defending them. He ended up killing this guy, and he ran away into the wilderness. Remember, wilderness means you're homeless now.
Right.
Okay, so he ran into the wilderness, and he ended up staying in the wilderness for 40 years. So he was in Egypt, he was 40 years old, then he was in the wilderness, homeless or nomadic, for 40 years. He was a shepherd, so he went from place to place to place. But he didn't always go back to the same place all the time. Anyway, and so he was in the desert or the wilderness for 40 years. And then he went back to Egypt, and under God's command, he was able to get all the people free. And then they went back into the wilderness for 40 years. So that means that this guy, Moses, he had 40 years living with the royal family, high end living, and then 80 years in the wilderness. That was his life. Wow. So can you imagine 80 years homeless?
No. I can't even imagine living that long.
I know. Okay. Then we have David, King David, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we know about King David. All right, so he was a shepherd, but he had a home. He would go out, take care of the sheep, and he'd come back home. Well, sometimes he'd stay overnight with the sheep, but he wouldn't do that. And he had a home. And then there was the whole thing with Goliath.
Yeah.
He fought Goliath, and then he became a warrior for a while, and he became one of the king's personal guards and really important. And then the king decided that he hated him. And then David had to run away from the king for 4 years in the wilderness. So David had to spend 4 years homeless.
Wow.
And then after that 4 years, he ended up going and becoming king after that. But he was 4 years out there. Now he wandered around the wilderness for a while, and then he also went into another country. Now there were a lot of countries over there, and now Goliath was a Philistine, right? Right. And all the Philistines hated David. When he had to go to another country, had to leave Israel and go to another country, guess what other country he went to? The land of the Philistines.
Yeah, Philistines.
I don't understand it, but anyway, that's what happened. That's what happened. Okay, another guy, Elijah. You guys heard about Elijah, right? So Elijah did a lot of miracles. He did all that. He also challenged all the priests of the false god Baal. He challenged them to a showdown on a place called Mount Carmel, and he basically said, I'll call fire down from my God, and you call fire down from your God, and we'll see who wins. Elijah won, and so he told the people to kill off all the other priests, which were like 500.
Whoa!
Wow.
And so now the king and queen who were supporting this other religion didn't exactly like that, so they chased Elijah away. And he had to run and hide and live in a cave for 40 days. And then eventually he started doing some couch surfing in another country. So he was in exile in another country, and he had to leave. So he was homeless. He was homeless in a cave for 40 days. And then he was exiled and kicked out of his country for a number of years.
Wow.
And so
I can't imagine being kicked out of your country.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
So
It's just like, we don't like you. Go live in Mexico.
Yeah.
Wait. Okay. I don't speak their language.
Take me home now. I don't want to go to Mexico.
I don't know. I don't know if that Mexico would be so bad, but I don't know.
Really?
I don't know. Okay. So there's plenty of other people in the Bible who are home. These are kind of the highlights. But there's this guy named Jephthah. He lived homeless for at least a decade. There's Paul, the apostle. He was homeless. He went from town to town. He was couch surfing. Peter, he was homeless. He had to be chased from one town into another town into another town.
Wow.
He was, yeah. You remember Ruth?
Yeah.
Ruth and her mother-in-law. When they came back to Israel, they were homeless.
Oh.
They didn't have husbands or sons to stay with, and so they were homeless for a while.
I didn't know that.
And then of course you've got Jesus. We know that Jesus was homeless. Mostly he was couch surfing. Okay, but we'll get back to Jesus in a little bit. Anyway, the thing is that it looks like, you look in the Bible pretty carefully, it seems like Every really important person that God has them be homeless for a period of time. And in the New Testament, we have a lot of people who were homeless. We've got Philip, we've got all these different kinds of people. Barnabas, Timothy, Mark, they were all homeless for a period of time. And so the thing is that a lot of times people look at homeless people and they say, oh, those homeless people, they're bad people or whatever. According to the Bible, if you're homeless, that could very well be that God is prepping you for a much bigger project.
Yeah.
For some of these people, they were homeless, that God chose them and then they became homeless right away. For some of them, they did something really important for God and then they became homeless. Or sometimes they were homeless before and after. And so these things happen. But a lot of times in the Bible, if you see someone who is homeless, who is wandering around, a lot of times that person is actually in preparation to being really blessed by God. They're not bad people at all. It's just the opposite. Just the opposite. People who are homeless in the Bible, that is an indication to say, hey, God's going to do something with this person. God is really working with this person. They're going to do something amazing. So when Jesus was in the wilderness, read homeless, for 40 days, that was a mark of God saying, hey, God's going to do something with him. Because that's one of the things that God uses to indicate to other people, hey, this is a person who God is looking at. Okay. So that's the thing. The funny thing is that a lot of times homelessness in the Bible is like the opposite of the way that people think about homelessness today, especially Christians. Christians see homeless people and they say, oh, well, that person had something, they did something bad or something, they have something wrong in their life or something like that. Nope, not in the Bible. It's the opposite. In the Bible, it's just like, oh, that person's homeless. Oh, we better keep our eye on him because God's going to do something amazing with that person. And so, and a lot of times I've seen people who are homeless here on the street. It's that same way. It does not mean that there aren't bad people on the street, because there really are. There are definitely bad people on the street. But more often than not, God is going to use those people. It's going to use them one way or another. All right. So what I want to do is I want us to look specifically at a particular group of people who are homeless and some of the lessons that they had. And so the people I want to look at specifically are the children of Israel after they left Egypt. So remember, Moses went to the children of Israel in Egypt and said, let's work on a project together. We're going to get you guys out of slavery. And they said, that sounds great. And then you got 10 plagues, right?
Yeah.
And after the 10 plagues, Pharaoh let them go. Okay. And so, but I'm not sure if you remember what happened to them after he let them go. I'm sure you remember one thing. We'll talk about that. So right after, it says in, did I write down the chapter? I did. That'd be 13. So starting at Exodus 13, starting at verse 17. Okay. Now, when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God said, the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Okay, so when you're going to Egypt and going toward modern Israel, there is a pathway right next to the Mediterranean Sea, and that's an easy way to go. That's the main route. Everybody would take that route. Everybody would go there. That is the little walkway between Africa and Asia. And so when there was a trade route, so let's say you were in Iraq and you wanted to go to Egypt, you'd go up and around and down that trade route. Everybody went that particular path. God is saying, we're not going to take them that way. Not going to go that way, because then they're going to go into another land that's going to fight them, and then they'll run back. And God said, we're not going to do that. Okay, so we're not going to take that path that everybody else takes. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness. We hear wilderness. What does that mean? Homeless. Okay. To the Red Sea. Oh, yeah, we remember the Red Sea. Okay, so he takes them to the Red Sea. And the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. Moses took the bones of Pharaoh with them, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will take care of you. You shall carry my bones from here with you. So then they set out from Succoth and camped in Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light. Remember the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. First of all, the cloud is not changing. It is a kind of a bright, shiny cloud that by day looked like a cloud, and at night it looked like fire, and it is the glory of God. That is the glory of God, or what is also called Shekinah. And so that's the glory of God. That is the presence of God with them right there. That is what ended up in the temple eventually. Okay, so so they're being led by God, specifically where to go. So the cloud goes to a certain place, and that's the direction they go into. All right. And he did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before, let's see, Pihahiroth. That was a guess. I'm sure I brutally murdered that. Between Migdol and the sea. And you shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite it by the sea. 4. Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimless in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So what did God do? God says, okay, so I'm not going to take them by the main route that everybody goes. Instead, I'm going to lead them down to this peninsula that they can't get out of. They're going to back them up against the sea. They're going to wander around a little bit and then back them up against the sea, so that way they can't escape and Pharaoh will come after them. That was God's plan. I think that particular plan was a particularly mean plan. I think it's awful for the poor children of Israel. They just got out of slavery. And now God wanders them around in the wilderness for a little ways and then backs them up against it. So it looks like they're just idiots and they don't know where they're going. And then he backs them up against the sea, so that way they're stuck. And Pharaoh says, let's go get them. Let's bring them back. They're idiots. They don't even know what they're doing. Let's go get them and bring them back. And so Pharaoh goes and takes his army in order to grab the Israelites and drag them back into slavery. Well, we know what happens, right? God tells Moses, put your staff over the sea splits, they walk across the sea, Pharaoh's army tries to follow them, the sea crashes in on them, and they're on the other side. And so what God did is he backed them up into a corner. And then he said, just watch and I'm going to deliver you. He put them into an impossible situation and then said, watch what I'm going to do. And he did it. And you ever remember an impossible situation that God backed you up in a corner and yet God got you out of it? It happens. And I'll tell you, it happens a lot more if you're homeless.
Yeah.
Because then you're in a situation where a lot of times the only person who can help you is God.
Yeah.
That's what God wanted these guys to do. He wanted them to be in a place where the only person who could possibly save them is God. They thought that if they had gone the other route, they may have said, oh, well, we can do this ourselves, or we're going to go back, or whatever. They have choices. God put them in a corner where they have no choices. which in a sense is kind of mean. But God knew what he was going to do, even though they didn't.
Right.
And it wasn't that God didn't tell them. God said, I'm going to save you. Stop worrying. You don't need to cry out or anything like that. You're going to be just fine. He said that over and over and over again. But I'll tell you, when your back is against the seat and the front has Pharaoh's army and it looks like you're going to be dead, you're going to be doing a lot of crying out.
Yep.
When you are stuck in a situation where it looks like you can't even survive another day in the situation that you're in, and you can't deal with it, and someone is abusing you or something like that, it feels like you are in an impossible situation.
Filled that well up.
Yeah, but if God is with you in that situation, then God can deliver you.
I know I became closer to God too through homelessness.
Yeah.
I don't know if she did, but yeah.
All right, so then and then at the end of chapter 15, Exodus 15, starting at verse 22. So God delivered them. They're on the other side. They're praising God. They go to sleep that night. They wake up in the morning, and then it says, Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. They went out to the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. They're in the desert. There's no water.
Wow.
Then they came to a place called Marah, and they couldn't drink the waters of Marah because they were bitter. Now, bitter water in the Bible means poisoned.
Oh.
The water was poisoned. Okay? And that's why it was named Marah, because Marah in Hebrew means bitter. Okay, so the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what is it that we're going to drink? That makes sense. I would complain too. Okay, we got poison water or no water. Yeah. And so then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. Sweet water means drinkable water. Okay, so bitter water, poison. Sweet water means drinkable. And then it says, and he made them a statute and regulation. And he said, if you would give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. Meaning God is saying, I'm not going to let horrible things happen to you. I brought you here. I'm going to take care of you. It's going to be okay. And then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the water. So there's plenty of food, plenty to drink. They were good. Okay. And then right after that, God led them to another place, and they had already gotten all this water, and they've got water that they're carrying with them and all that. But they go to a place and there's no food. And they're just like, oh, man, we really want some food. We really need some food. You know, we've got kids and they're hungry and they're crying. We need some food. And then they said, you know what? If we're not going to get any food, we're going back to Egypt. We're going to go back and all that. So God, you give us food now or we're leaving. And God said, fine, I'll give you food. And then he provided what was later called manna. Okay, and manna is a substance that they found on plants, and it says that they tasted like honey and coriander. So it's a little sweet and had a little bit of spice to it. And you could pound it and make it into a bread, but it wasn't bread. It was a different kind of a compound. Anyway, and if you go to the wilderness where they were at, you can go there today, and you can still find this stuff. You can't find enough of it to feed thousands of people, but you can still find this stuff on the plants. You pick it up off the plants, and then you can eat it. But what God did is God said, all right, so this is what you're going to do. For 6 days, you're going to collect all the manna that you need for that day. Don't hold any overnight. And so what some people did.
Held it overnight.
Some people held it overnight, and so they woke up the next day, and it's all wormy.
Yeah.
and then they have to clean out their baskets, and then they have to start all over again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you've been on the street, you've had that experience. You don't want to leave food around that much because, you'll end up with some sort of wildlife in your food. And so you gotta keep it moving. All right. So God said, don't hold any overnight, except, he said, just before the Sabbath. On the Sabbath day, or just the day before the Sabbath day, collect 2 amounts of manna. And you're going to get twice as much. And when you get the manna, you make sure that you're getting enough for you and for everyone in your family and for everyone that you're helping. You make sure that you have enough for everybody. He says an omer apiece. I don't know how big an omer is. I don't know if anybody knows how much an omer is, but we're saying maybe an omer is like a loaf of bread. And that's enough for a person for a day. Okay? Everybody gets like about that much. And then so everybody has enough, no more, no less. You just take what you need. And then, but on the Sabbath day, you take twice as much as you need. And so that way you don't have to pick any up on that day because that's the day of rest. So God says on that day, you don't do that. You go ahead and you pick up twice as much the day before, and it will not spoil. It won't spoil. Just that one day. All the other days, it's going to spoil, but not on that day. I'll protect it on that day, and it won't spoil. And so what did some people do? Not pick up twice as many just before the Sabbath, because some people are still trying to figure this out. And so they pick up bread, they pick up, and then the next day they go, oh, we're hungry. And Moses said, I told you to pick up twice as much on this day. Next time do it, and you won't go hungry. Anyway, so everybody shared, and it was fine. Everybody was okay. But that was the thing that God's trying to say. There are rules when you're homeless. There are basic rules. Number one, you share with other people. You got it. If you're out on the street, you share.
Yeah.
Share with the people who don't have enough. Number two, you want to make sure that you only take what you need. Don't take extra. Because if you take more than you need, then it's just going to spoil. Yeah. It's going to go bad. And why would anybody want to do that? So you just take what you need. And God is basically saying, listen to what I'm saying. Follow the instructions. Give yourself some rest. Don't be pushing yourself all the time. You can trust that I'm going to take care of you. And there are times that you just need to be taken care of. And it's going to be okay. Anyway, so there's that. Then the whole thing, they get to another place, there's no water. And they're like, oh, okay, God, this is it. That's it. We're going to get a camp together. We're going back to Egypt because we're tired of this no water, no food. We're tired of this. And God just says, okay, all right. And he tells Moses to hit the staff with the rock, and the water came from the rock, and everybody had enough to drink. And he's just like, I'm tired of you guys going back and testing me. Now, testing God in this context means trying to force God's hand. God, you either do this or I'm going to turn away from you. You either do this or I'm going to reject you. And it says in the Bible again and again, don't test God. Don't put him to the test. Don't try to force his hand because he doesn't like that very well. God's the one in charge. We are not. We sometimes forget that. Okay, and so you've got all of these things going on, and there's just a few now. The children of Israel learned a whole bunch more lessons out in the wilderness because they were in the wilderness for 40 years. It was, by the way, to the beginning. It was only going to be maybe 50 days.
Oh wow!
But there were some things that happened. There were a number of things that happened. Anyway, it ended up being 40 years out in the wilderness. And
thinking you're only going to be there that long, and then
yeah. I mean, they're basically thinking they're just on the way to the promised land. It's going to happen real soon. But it all got screwed up, and so that was so they ended up in the wilderness for 40 years. The reason that God chose 40 years, by the way, is God says, I want every one every person in this generation to die. Your children will enter the land. But nobody of this generation, because you guys are all screwed up. And so, so it's going to take 40 years of training your kids to enter into the land, so that way they'll listen to me. But none of you guys are ready for it. Anyway, that's how. Now, okay. So now we're going to read Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4. So we're in the New Testament, and this is Jesus. And we're going to look at a few things and see if anything sounds familiar at this point. With all that as background, let's read about what Jesus went through in the wilderness. Okay, so Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil.
Yeah.
So Jesus is led by God to go into the wilderness. So this wasn't a bad plan. God was establishing this plan, the same thing that he always does with his people. Is you're going to be homeless for a little while to get you ready for the next step. Okay? So after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, first of all, he wasn't eating for 40 days and 40 nights. It's an interesting thing. Have you guys ever gone through like days of not eating? Have you? Have you ever had that experience? No? Well, what happens is if you're completely stopped eating for about 3 days or so, you stop being hungry.
Mm-hmm.
All of
That's
a sudden,
the way I was most of the homeless time.
oh, you just weren't hungry.
I never was hungry.
Yeah. And so what it is you can go days and days without eating. Most of us have enough extra reserve in our body that it's no problem. Even, our bodies will eat up our muscle, and they will eat up. Unfortunately, a lot of times our bodies will eat up the muscle before they eat up the fat. And we should win the other way around.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you fast for a little while, and from about third or fourth day, you stop being hungry. Just not hungry anymore. Not interested in eating. All of a sudden, your body just switches that part off and just says, "Okay, we're not going to bother you with being hungry because you're not giving us anything anyway." And so you're not hungry anymore. And although for like the first 3 days, all you can think about is food.
Yeah.
Just think about food all the time, just food. And then after that, you don't think about it anymore. Anyway, and so when it says that after 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, that means that his body has eaten up all his reserves. And now he's hungry again after not being hungry for a lot of days. So now he's hungry again. That means his body is now down at 0. He's got nothing. There's like no more muscle for the body to eat, no more fat for the body to eat. He really needs to eat. Okay? Guess when Satan comes? Yeah, that's the time. So the tempter came to him and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." That's a pretty good one, actually. Oh, I'm starving to death, and now you're telling me to do it. Yeah, well, it sounds really good. Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Okay. Who was in the wilderness and was really upset because they didn't have any bread to eat? Oh, the children of Israel.
Yeah.
Same thing. They were homeless. They didn't have any bread. And they complained to God and said, "Oh, we're going to leave." And Jesus answered and says, "No, I'm going to wait until God says it's time."
Yeah.
So Jesus is doing the opposite. He's not telling God what to do. He's waiting for God to tell him what to do.
Right.
Oh, so he's doing it differently. Okay. The devil took him to the holy city, Jerusalem, had him stand at the highest point of the temple. And he said, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift up their heads that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Satan says, "Well, if you want to be the Son of God, then all you have to do is jump from the temple, and then the angels will catch you and float you down, and everyone will see you, and then they will declare you to be the Son of God, and you're in there. You've got it right there." And Jesus answered, and it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Meaning, don't force God's hand.
Right.
Jesus is like, no, that's forcing God to, he may be promising me this, but I'm not going to force God's hand. That's not my place to do that. It's God's place. I'm going to wait for him to do that. So that's strike two. And then again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor. And he says, I'm going to give you all of this. I'm going to give you the whole world, all the best cities in the world, if you would but bow down and worship me. And Jesus said, get away from me, Satan. It is written, worship the Lord your God, and you will serve him only.
Yeah.
When the people of Israel were in there, and they were like, oh, we're not eating and we're not getting the water that we need, what are we going to do? We're going to go back.
Right.
Go back to Egypt and basically bow down before Egypt and do whatever they say, just that way we can have our food and our water. And this, Satan is offering Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. All you have to do is worship. And Jesus says, nope, not doing that. I'm sticking with God. I'm not having anything to do with you. So the thing is that these are the lessons that God is hoping we're going to learn when we become homeless. These are the lessons. First of all, he wants us to learn to trust that God is going to provide for us, that God cares enough about us that he doesn't want us to be destroyed, and God's going to take care of us. That's the first thing he wants us to learn. Didn't matter whether it was the children of Egypt or children of Israel or Jesus. God wants us to learn that he will take care of us. It's just like what you were saying, that you were out on the street, but now that you're in a place, you don't worry about things so much because you've already been through the worst.
Right.
And God took care of you there. Well, he's certainly going to take care of you in this situation, right? Yep. All right. Secondly, don't test God or don't force God's hand. If you've got a situation and it's horrible, God promised to take care of you, and he will. It's going to be okay. God is going to, but you don't have to try to force God, or you don't have to try to do any bargains with God.
I was going to say, like you were saying, some people do the opposite. Well, I'll do this. I'll go to church every Sunday if you do this for me. Yeah. And it's the opposite of what he's saying, or what Jesus is saying there, that if you don't do this for me, I'm going to leave. Right. And so, but in a sense, it's kind of the same thing. You're trying to bargain with God. Don't need to bargain with God. There's no reason for it. God already wants to take care of us. Yep. God already wants to get us out of the situations. And then the other lesson that God wants us to make sure to listen is don't serve other gods. Right.
There are a lot of times when you're homeless, it's such a horrible situation. Sometimes you end up hanging with people that you know you shouldn't, because you just want that protection or just want to be cared for. So you end up hanging with people that aren't going to be good for you, and you know that. Sometimes when you're homeless, you're going to get into an organization, and you know the organization isn't any good.
Yeah.
But you think they're going to help you. You think that they're going to do you some good, and so you end up going with them, or you agree to do something that you know is wrong, or doing something you know is wrong, but you just go, well, but I don't see any way out of it. And these are all other types of answers, other types of solutions, other than what God is trying to teach us. And it's really easy to go in those ways. And we have seen so many people do that a lot of times because they didn't have any hope in God to begin with.
Right. And that's the way it is out there, a lot of them.
And so God wants us to learn to trust him in this. Now, I'll say a couple things, though. 40 days to wilderness, 40 days homeless is really hard. 40 days homeless, not eating is really, really hard. That would be difficult. I don't know of very many people. I know very few people that have had that.
40 days.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I do know of people who have not eaten for 40 days. I know 2 or 3 people who have done that. One of which didn't actually have much extra anyway. But I've not. I don't think I know of anybody that did it while they were living on the street. That combination is really tough. Living homeless for a year or 2 years is really hard. Or 3 years or 4 years. It's hard. It's hard to continue to hope after so long. And I don't think that God is blaming anybody who has had to struggle with that for so long and falling into weaknesses. No, God is not judging anybody for that, because after a while, we are only human and we can only take so much. And we're going to fall into things that we never thought that we would do. And sometimes I wonder if some of the people that God chooses, sometimes I wonder if those people that God will sometimes allow them to fall into really bad things, so that way they can help people who also fall down. Let people fall into addictions or bad relationships or something like that, so that way they can help somebody else when they end up going that direction too. I wonder if that doesn't happen sometimes. I don't know. I know that God does not tempt us to evil. He doesn't want us to do things that we know are wrong, but at the same time,
He's forgiving.
He's forgiving, and he uses it. He uses these things. There's the story of Joseph, not Joseph, the husband of Mary, but Joseph, Joseph the many-colored coat, the dreamer who had the dreams and all that. His brothers hated him, and they beat him up and thought that they were going to kill him. And then they decided not to kill him, but sold him into slavery instead. Their own brother. They sold their own brother into slavery. And didn't see him again until he was way older. And then they didn't recognize him. And he ended up taking one of his brothers and putting him in prison and all that for a while. Anyway, but it turned out that they were all reunited, but they were always scared. They were always nervous that Joseph was going to take revenge on them. And what he said was, the thing is that, yeah, what you did was really evil. Selling me into slavery was not a good move. But what you intended for evil, God used it for good. There was good things that happened because of that situation. And it wasn't that God couldn't have made it happen some other way. But he used the situation, and so he says, I'm just going to forgive you because, it turned out okay. And I think that a lot of times we need to do that for ourselves.
Yeah.
That we need to say, you know what? These things happen, or I did this thing and it's horrible. And maybe I made the choice to do something that was really bad and wrong, and I knew it was wrong, but I chose it anyway. But God is going to turn that into good. God is going to turn that around and turn it into something good. And we have to stop beating ourselves up about it. We just got to get on with our lives.
It's a hard thing. Just quit beating yourself up.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. All right. And so those are the things I wanted to say, just as far as lessons that God wants us to learn in the Bible. And once again, these are just a few things. God put a lot of people through homelessness, and he taught them all different things. God taught David to love his enemy while he was homeless.
Right.
God taught Elijah to not be so depressed while he was homeless. He taught all these different lessons, and it's all throughout the Bible. And so I just encourage you, next time you're reading the Bible, look for the homeless people, because the homeless people are the people who God is going to have special choose them especially for his work. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay.
All right.